I'm in the business of wanting to resurrect that triumphant beast in you.
Welcome to The Boundless Body, the podcast with a somatic doctor interviewing innovative thinkers about their perspectives relating to the arts and sciences of therapy. Discover The Boundless Body.
Back to the mystery.
Becky Aste, welcome to the Boundless Body podcast. It's so good to have you here. I'm really stoked.
Thanks, Brian. Love the alliteration. Wouldn't be on a podcast without alliteration.
Yeah, Boundless Body and Breakthrough Blueprint with Becky.
Yeah.
Boundless Body with Brian and Breakthrough Blueprint with Becky.
Right? I didn't realize we had 3 B's each. That's amazing. This was meant to be.
Yeah, meant to be. So like, I'm already feeling like I'm warming up my mouth for some verbal antics. Yeah. I love your voiceovers. I mean, I was just talking in our pre-recording interview about how you do these really fun voiceovers on Instagram and make me laugh. I love your sense of humor.
Thank you. I have fun with it. Yeah, it's my favorite part of my business, I'd say, is the voiceover, the reels, and the podcast. But like, it always comes with a punch. You know, I like to get people's attention with just being a fool on Instagram, right? But then if you follow the caption, like, oh, there's some depth there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm a big advocate. I don't know if you saw that a little while back. I did an interview with a clown trainer who was my clown trainer who trained me to train clowns. So we're talking about the big cultural healing issues and stuff like that. But the long and short of that is that therapy can become really humorless.
Yeah.
And the teaching of therapy can become really humorless. And I see why, right? Because it's like not particularly funny content and material that we work through. We need to have that fool. We need to have that clown in order to keep things lightened up and, you know,
100%.
stay human, stay humble.
I love that so much. I mean, that's what originally drew me in. I'm sure we'll get to that. But like the turning point for me when I stumbled upon what helped me, it was humor. It was a funny reel about a woman joking about something that's really not funny. But I was like, I could use a laugh right now. My life feels pretty freaking serious and heavy, and I'm not laughing at anything. So it's what I needed.
Yeah, great. So I'm just going to read your intro here and then we'll proceed with some of the topics that we laid out, and we'll either go by the structure or we won't.
Sounds good. Sounds like us.
All right. Improv. Becky Aste is a trauma-informed marriage coach and somatic practitioner, CEO of I Do Breakthrough, and the proud host of Your Breakthrough Blueprint podcast, a top 5% globally ranked podcast. Becky spent a decade undergoing every mode and mainstream practice for saving her marriage after a long history of abandonment and betrayal, only to find herself 10 years later separated on the brink of divorce. That's when she found the buzzer beater, which we'll talk about later, the buzzer beater, the Hail Mary play of somatic work that completely changed the game for her, and now countless other marriages that she's coached around the world. All right, Becky. So can you tell, there's another alliteration there, buzzer beater. Becky the buzzer beater. What the heck is a buzzer beater?
So I grew up watching basketball with my dad. My cousin played for UConn. She'd get us free tickets in 96. And so as you know, basketball, the very last second of the game, the buzzer goes off. And so if you get the shot in as the buzzer's going off and it goes in, it counts. So that's exactly the term that comes to mind with how my marriage went, because it felt like we had tried everything and we were losing, right? We were failing. We were separated after 10 years of trying all this stuff and talking about divorce. So when I stumbled upon the program that I stumbled upon, it was my first introduction to somatic work. I was like, this is the one thing that I haven't tried. This is my last shot. So it felt like I was shooting my shot at the buzzer beater. I was like, if this goes in, amazing. Otherwise, I know I've tried everything I possibly can.
It's a swish, right?
Yeah.
Swish.
Yeah. So let's days, but it did end up going in.
Yeah. Was it more jerky than a swish?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it wasn't smooth and pretty and neat, but it did go in the end.
Yeah, we were talking in the warm up too about there's a whole subcategory of physics called jerk physics, which are talking about how there's these trajectories in physics where there's, nothing is a simple trajectory. You have all these jerks and starts and stops. And that's how a lot of the healing processes happen for me over time as well. The growth process is jerky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not just a smooth developmental line, right? It's like fits and starts and jerks.
No, it's not. Yeah. And that's like, especially when clients, or if they only see on Instagram, right, the snippet or like the summary of the story, they can get really frustrated at points working with me. Like, why doesn't this feel smooth or easy? And I'm like, let me tell you a story to sit in your chair. And it's fun to pull back the curtain and be like, no, like not one human on earth gets to, experience physics without the jerks.
Yeah, one of these great voiceovers that you do. You love to do deep men's voices in your voiceovers, right? There was this one that you were talking about detaching from an agenda in relationship, where it's like, and this was part of the buzzer beater process, right? Where you were confronted with a type of deep attachment, and then you just kind of gave up on that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I guess I have a thing for deep men's voiceovers on Instagram. It's the ones my community resonates with the most. But the thing that the voice was saying was basically like, people always tell me, how are you so chill? And I'm like, because I gave up. And that's really how I felt in my marriage. I was efforting and trying and needing it to work for 10 years, spending literally every window of time that I had. I remember being in the car and being like, I have 2 minutes to get from my home to my daycare. Let me put in a podcast on marriage so I can, make sure I'm not wasting any time to find the answer. Like, this was the energy that I kept up for 10 years. And come to find that was the exact energy that was creating this like repelling vibration between my husband and I. It was very smothering and suffocating for him. Like, oh my God, like there's never a peace and just like a, and so it got to this point where it's like, I gave up, where deep down, I was like, I still desperately do want my marriage to work. But it came to a point where for the first time ever, learning to move trauma out of my body, learning how somatic work, can change me. It's like I not only knew I'd be okay without him, like I felt it. I felt it in my spirit, in my cells, in my body that if this doesn't work out, if my quote unquote worst nightmare happens and we do divorce, like I actually know I'm going to be okay. And so that was like me quitting. It was just this detachment and being able to communicate that to him. Still being clear, like ultimately, I do hope for us to be able to repair. But for the first time ever, Sebastian, I feel it in my core that I'm going to be okay no matter what. And that was the beginning of him being like, whoa, okay, she's got herself for the first time ever.
Yeah. So then the neurobiology of separation, the neurobiologist Panksepp has a name for like the emotional cascade of intensities that happen when we're in separation distress. And he calls it the panic-grief system. So like this combination of panic and grief. And I often think that this kind of compulsive approaching behavior is an attempt to avoid the panic and grief that come with not just separation, but differentiation, right? Which is what we're talking about. Differentiation is that place of being an individual, not being caught up in a sort of magnetic field of approach, which can be very compulsive, right? It can be compulsive in psychodynamic language. I guess it would be a psychological defense, right? A defense against feeling the panic and the grief of being an individual, basically.
For individuals or couples interested in therapy or counseling, you can sign up for a free consultation or our newsletter for more information on integrative therapeutic modalities.
Man, I love that. I actually haven't heard those terms. And if you don't mind, I'm going to use those. But separation distress is exactly how it feels, it's the anxiety that comes from that distance. I remember a coach one time asking me to picture a tether ball. You remember the tether ball? Oh, yeah, you hit them. And she was like, imagine you're the pole, Becky, and Sebastian's the ball at the end of the string. How close to the pole feels safe for you, feels secure? And I was like, just touching. I don't want it smothered and smushed into the pole, but like, I want us to be touching. Like, that feels safe. And she started to, have me imagine the ball going a little bit further away, and asking me to notice what was coming up somatically in my body as that happened. And it was this distress, this anxiety, like, I don't want it any further. That feels scary. That feels unsafe. So what you said, the heightened panic and grief and this compulsive fixing energy being a way to avoid that was completely it, which is not what I would have thought at the time. I would call him the avoidant one and me being the one that was trying to face it. But it wasn't. It was a way of me avoiding my own pain too.
Yeah, it's actually a really similar molecular cascade, of neurochemistry in the panic, grief, separation, distress, as compared to withdrawal from an addictive substance. So withdrawal from the biggies, right? The big addictive substances on planet Earth has very similar structural connections with the intensities that are moving through when we're going through separation distress.
Mm-hmm.
It's wild, huh? So we're like literally going through like a major withdrawal state when we consider differentiating. And, it makes sense why we would be so frantically holding on to. And, withdrawal and avoidance is a different way of, avoiding a similar panic and grief. Like a lot of guys, I think, are, running this avoidant strategy.
Yeah.
They stonewall, they withdraw. I should say we, because I'm a dude. Right? I'm like, those guys over there, they withdraw. They use the silent treatment, all those, unevolved dudes over there.
And then me
Yes.
up here trying to be a man with my man voiceover.
Yeah, we use the withdrawal strategy a lot, but when the rubber hits the road with the real moment of the possibility of real separation, that's when the man can flip then into the panic and grief and then do whatever he's going to do with the panic and grief. So that could show up as rage. It could show up as dissociation and addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And things like that. But it's just, different profile of avoidance, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. This weekend, yesterday, I went to a brewery with my friends, our soccer crew, and we had our friends take the Saboteur assessment, which I don't know if you've heard of it. It's just like a 10-minute quiz. I can give it to you if you want to link it. But it is a 10-minute quiz to see which saboteurs, which are just like nicknames for how your ego shows up, little nicknames, of ways of self-protection. And all of the guys in the group tested avoider as number one. The quote unquote avoider was their number one saboteur, just the way that when they feel in distress, their ego jumps online to protect them. So I was like, how interesting. That just like went perfectly with what you just said.
Yeah. The avoider. So like 10 out of 10 or whatever, 100% of the guys.
100% of them. Yeah. And then all of us, the women, it was hyperachiever. Just maybe the type of women I end up hanging out with. And what are my top three? Hyperachiever, pleaser. So the fawn response, people pleasing. And then stickler, which is like perfectionist. So, I mean, even my close friends know, like at the times in my life when I was the most stressed or things felt most out of control, if they came over and they saw my home, like perfect, immaculate, very clean, they'd be like, Becky, you doing okay? I'm like, yeah, just fine. Just trying to keep everything together as life feels like it's falling apart.
Yeah. So it's the hyperachiever, the stickler.
Mm-hmm.
What are the other ones? The avoider?
Yep. The pleaser.
Uh-huh.
There's maybe 12 total, and it ranks. It'll tell you like 1 through 10 what your tops are and like how high you score in them. And some of the others are like restless, hypervigilant, hyper rational. There's, a whole list of them, but it's pretty fascinating. I use it with all my clients, their orientation call. I'm like, can you take this test? Because it comes in helpful in moments when they are really triggered. We can just turn it into a more inquisitive and even like benevolent tone. Like, hey, which stickler is showing up right here? Like, which friend is popping up? Because really they are there in wisdom. They're there to protect us, but we can learn how to even talk to them, kind of like Inside Out. I don't know if you saw Inside Out. Yeah, I just saw it Friday night, the second one. But there's a way to befriend them in order to move through the triggers.
Yeah, the sabotage thing, that's quite interesting. I like to tell couples when I'm working with couples that the paradox of healing is that we're allergic to healing. That we say that we want to heal and grow, or in the context of couples therapy, we might say that we want our partner to heal and grow. But when they actually start healing and growing, all sorts of strange sabotaging mechanisms come up. And I think it's really just like the habits of the brain. Like the conscious mind says, oh yeah, like for example, I want my partner to be more emotionally literate. I want them to become less numb. I want them to be more emotional. But then when it shows up in the treatment room, when the partner starts showing anger, for example, then immediately the partner will shut them down.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait, hang on. You were just asking. In fact, that was one of the reasons why you came to therapy in the first place, was for your partner to become less numb. Now they've just, displayed that capacity, and now you're sabotaging it.
It's 100% a thing. It's so interesting. And you've probably seen the quote going around Instagram, but like our nervous system doesn't give a shit between what's good for us, what's bad for us. It just wants what's familiar. And I noticed the same thing recently. It's like, because me and Sebastian have evolved. We've had like different, right, like phases of our relationship. And even recently, it felt like he was leveling up, and it freaked me the F out. Like he went on his first men's retreat. He was actually diving deeper on his healing journey than ever. And I'm like, why am I having all of these old, super hyper vigilant fears like come out? It was also, the timing was also when we put my mom on hospice. So did make sense, right? Just this fear of, oh my gosh, I'm losing my mom. And so now I really can't lose Sebastian. But my nervous system was witnessing him be different, like on another, level. And I was freaking out. And my friend noticed it. She was like, Becky, when my husband really started healing, I should have been the happiest I'd ever been. This is what I was praying for. And I was like, a mess. What is this?
Another funny word construct here is the Sebastian sabotager.
We go.
You could do a good voiceover with that. I am the Sebastian sabotager.
Sure, he love that. I was already like, oh God, my wife on Instagram again. Here we go.
Some of the old psychodynamic theorists, they talk a lot about envy. It's talked about less often these days. That something about the sabotaging process, when we sabotage our partners because we're afraid they're going to grow beyond us or something, that some of that has to do with envy. It's a weird idea, huh?
Can you expand on that?
Oh gosh, you're going to ask me. This is my podcast. Okay. Well, so envy, one of the best books on envy, and there's not that many, is called Cinderella and Her Sisters. Okay. And so you have this archetypal fairy tale, in Cinderella, where the wicked stepmother and then the stepsisters that are envious of Cinderella. And in this book, they're trying to kind of like wrap their head around, what are their names? The writers. Shoot, it's not going to come to me right now, but it might come later. so they're kind of like trying to wrap their heads around, why are the stepsisters envious? Like, what are they envious about with Cinderella? And it's not just her beauty, it's her goodness is what they come up with in the end. So they're talking about how fundamental to envy is a sense that we feel like we don't have a particular type of goodness or type of power that another person has. So our unconscious starts to mobilize all sorts of projectiles, like venom on an arrow or something like that, venomous arrows to puncture that person's goodness because we can't tolerate the fact that somebody else has it and we don't.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
So like if our partner starts to acquire something that we feel a type of goodness or a type of power that we don't feel like we have, then those poison tipped arrows can start to come out.
Yeah.
And and it's a nasty thing. Envy doesn't get talked about enough. I don't think it's not just in relationship, but in, groups and
Yeah.
it shows up all over social media, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's been just even roles that we've noticed we've slipped into, like the good one, the bad one, the victim, the perpetrator. And then we've like played out those roles in our marriage. And we've had to learn how to name those and catch it in the moment. Like, ooh, like this is old dance right now. This is kind of acting like, oh, Sebastian's the good one and Becky is the crazy one or bad one, or vice versa. Like I'm the good one and he's the bad one. And so trying to break that cycle, just naming it, like, okay, go back to what we want. We want to be equals. We want to be partners. We don't want to pigeonhole ourselves into these roles that really are limiting and have kept us stuck for so many years. So that book sounds interesting. Cinderella and her sisters.
Yeah, and they distinguish it from jealousy, which is a difficult differentiating envy from jealousy. Now, jealousy is obviously really important to understand with betrayal trauma. You've navigated and you're an expert in betrayal trauma. You work with a lot of women that have had to struggle with betrayal trauma, right?
Yes.
So I'm wanting to just, before I throw down how they conceptually differentiate envy from jealousy, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about jealousy and betrayal trauma.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So with betrayal trauma, some people just even want to know, what does that even mean? It is the obvious infidelity and affair in the marriage, but it can also be experienced by certain couples who feel like porn, for example, is just on the same level as going outside of the marriage. And so betrayal isn't so much about the action itself. It's really how the individual interprets it. Like if a woman feels betrayed in any way, that can have an impact on her nervous system in a very unique way. A lot of what I see is this hypervigilance, so for example, if their husband's phone is buzzing, just getting a text message or an alert, it's this is where the jealousy can come up. Like, oh my God, who is he really talking to? Is that another woman? Is this taking away, right, from what I have with him? Who's on the other side? What's he doing? What's he thinking? Same thing with searching, through his search history or just even his day-to-day actions. Let's say he's coming home from work and he's 5 minutes later than normal. It's this hyper-vigilant state of like, are you fully with me? Are you fully staying with me? Are you fully thinking about me, committed to me, loyal to me? Or is there any kind of hint that I'm seeing, this clue to tell me otherwise, that you're on your way out or thinking of someone else, even if you're physically going to stay here? And so the impact, it can have this jealousy. It's really the scarcity mindset, this fear of like, I am not safe. I don't have enough. I can't trust that he's fully going to meet my need of, for many, it's that tetherball pole example, Blair. Like, I want him to stay close to me at all times. and there's a fear of the ball when it moves away, it's not safe. And so it's learning how to practice how that actually can be very safe and very healthy and more freeing for both parties when you learn how to do that in a way that's, honoring to your core values.
So you work with infidelity trauma a lot with women. And so in infidelity, obviously there's, I guess there's a lot of different ways that infidelity can happen. Maybe let's focus on the classical having sex with another person.
Yeah.
And when that other person is engaged with, I'm imagining that all sorts of stuff comes up for the one that's been betrayed. And I'm imagining that jealousy is one of them because there's another person getting the goods, the attention, the love, the romance, the whatever it is, and it's going not into the relationship, it's going out. What have you learned about jealousy towards the person that the betraying person goes to and engages with and has sex with?
So like jealousy towards the affair partner?
Yeah.
There's so much fantasy of revenge there. There's so much just absolute venom, hatred, anger. I want to go slash her tires. Who is she? Where can I find her? And these kinds of feelings can be terrifying for a client to experience. Like, oh my God, this is not the kind of person I am. And there can be this kind of sequential shame spiral of what is wrong with me for thinking these thoughts. This is totally against my core values. The practice here is so much freaking radical self-compassion and honoring of, hey, this is the wisdom of your nervous system. Your nervous system perceives this just as much of a threat as if a bear just walked into your house and was about to attack you. As humans, we are wired for love, safety, belonging. So if you in a marriage get love, security, belonging from knowing like, hey, it's me and him, there's faithfulness. If some affair partner, comes into the picture, it's the same thing as a bear. Like your nervous system hopefully is going to wisely respond and activate in a way to protect you. So that can be fight a lot of times, even if it's just like in a person's imagination, like I will find her and I will get her. Or flight can be mixed in with the fantasy, just like imagining how to repay or how to like eliminate the threat, get rid of the threat. Fawn, response, whether that's trying to remind your husband of why you're better than her. You get into this like competitive, almost engaging, whether that's using sex to remind him of what he'd be missing out on if he actually left, or just getting on your soapbox and giving a spiel to like why this marriage is more important to work towards than anything out there. So it's just noticing whatever the response is that comes up, that there's wisdom in it, and there needs to be so much self-compassion. But yeah, jealousy and anger come online very quick with situations like that.
Revenge. Yeah, that's intense. Revenge, you use the two words revenge and venom. I'm associating it as a kind of, and so this is back to how they distinguish jealousy from envy. That the long and short of it, I guess, is that jealousy is hot and envy is cold. That, crimes of passion often happen in this hot, kind of revengeful, the poison goes out. It's a fiery enactment. Whereas envy is this cold, and you see these images and fairy tales of these ice queens freezing life out. And it's often more calculated. So I'm thinking about jealousy as a kind of, or at least how it's articulated in the literature is, I think what's different is that envy is like, we feel like we don't have something that another person has.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to freeze them out. Whereas jealousy is we feel like we have this something and we're going to get revenge that, the energy went somewhere else. And,
Mm-hmm.
somebody else. So it's like, I have it. Can't you see that I have it?
Mm-hmm.
Now you're in trouble because you didn't see that I have it, but I have, envy is, can you see how that's, do you vibe with that? Can you
Yeah.
make some sense of that?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
super interesting. It's true. Yeah. And it's also interesting just how society or like however you're conditioned can heap more trouble upon the already like intense feeling you're experiencing. So jealousy and envy, are already like a lot to deal with. They're already big emotions that we need help working through. But then on top of that, whether it's from our upbringing, religious conditioning, messages from society, there is that second layer of shame. And I don't know if I've talked about this with you or if you've heard it, but Tara Brach, the Buddhist meditation teacher, she always talks about that. The second arrow of shame from the Buddhist teaching, where it's like we have two arrows that hit us. The first is like normal human suffering that we all go through, the typical feelings like jealousy, like anger, like envy. But then the second arrow is the one that we shoot ourselves with. And that's the one of shame. And it's this arrow that says, I'm bad for feeling the first one. And so what I like to work on first with people is the second arrow, actually, because it's just like we need to dissolve the shame before we can get to any kind of the hurt and pain underneath. If we're in a shame spiral, it's like useless to try to work through with new tools or however great the practitioner is that you're working with or whatever. It's all going to go in one ear out the other if you're in this shame storm.
Yeah, because there's aggression is a fundamental. If the sanctity of a relationship has been intruded upon, that the inner animal is going to just get pissed off, aggressive. So if you got that secondary layer, and often it starts from a really young age in terms of cultural conditioning, where there's a false self that's already there in the first place, a construct that's kind of filtering the aggression out and repressing the aggression. So that's quite interesting, right? Just working with this secondary arrow of shame to try to get a person back in touch with, well, it's natural to feel aggressive. It's natural to feel, a sense of intrusion, rage, this revenge thing. This revenge thing has been played out, for eons, for millennia in human tribal cultures, for example, the vendetta. There's this thing called the vendetta where tribal justice in the earliest times, this is how justice was meted out, was through revenge. If something bad happens and there's freeloaders in the community or whatever, or a murder happens or something like that, or a theft, then there's a kind of organized tribunal and the sending out of what's called a vendetta, which is a organized revenge, essentially. So it's this really deep kind of orientation to, meting out justice through revenge. And that's, it's deep in our biology. I think it's deep in our somatic. I think it's pretty useless to just say, go to the moral, what is it called? The spiritual bypass, the moral bypass, which is like, no, that stuff is just bad. Don't do it.
Yeah.
And then I think that can be a part of this functional freeze response that you talk about so much, right? Where we're just kind of inundated with arrows from different directions and we just freeze.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, there's these, like you said, natural bodily impulses, but then we stop ourselves from expressing those because of, either conditioning, fear. Oh my God, especially anger, and especially in women. I think it's very taboo. I'm curious your thoughts because I know you work with couples. And I more so work with the women. But I know for women, anger is like so taboo and we don't want to be seen as this like crazy bee. Whereas it seems like men, it feels more accepted sometimes. But it's learning how to let that move through our body and even move that out of our body so that it doesn't get stuck. Our body does keep the score of whatever we've been through. And it does end up living inside of us and getting like metastasized and stuck inside of us if we don't know how to complete this cycle that was trying to happen because of a very real threat or a very real danger. The fear a lot for women is, oh my God, anger is bad. I don't want to hurt myself and I don't want to hurt other people. So we just swallow it. And then we wonder, like, why do I have neck tension everywhere? And why can't I breathe? And why are all these random aches and pains? Like all these body symptoms, or sometimes our body just saying, like, hey, there's some trauma to clear out. So sometimes when appropriate, it's helping women go back to that moment when they wanted to express something or say something or do something. And with safe guidance, let them play that out so that it becomes this complete cycle, and learning to, especially with like sacred rage, get that out of the body, go to rage rooms. I've done it in like my friend's wooded area in the backyard. Like we can dive into what sacred rage looks like, but there is a way to get that out without harming you or other people.
I wouldn't put you on the spot and actually have you show us what it looks like. Well, maybe I would. I don't know. Would I? Could I?
I mean, there's so much that comes to mind. I don't want to scream into listeners' ears if they've got their AirPod. Like there is a lot of screaming, like I very simply, if I'm feeling like, oh my God, I want to erupt, there's anger that needs to move through me, I might go and scream into my pillow or like punch the hell out of my mattress. If you do have the opportunity to go to a rage room or go to a place that's not gonna, like a backwooded area, my friend has an amazing 3 acres of just woods to herself. We've brought wine glasses, plates, we've Sharpied things on them and just let it rip. In yoga, there's the fire breath, that they do a lot. And when I first started doing yoga, I was like, what the F is wrong with these people? They're crazy. But it is like such a healthy, and it works, somatic way to release. Just like, like tongue sticking out, just absolute like letting breath out like that. So kids know how to do it naturally. We just learn like
Where's my chocolate? What?
I encourage that when my kids do that. No, like it's funny trying to play with Ollie, especially my 8-year-old. He's gotten to a point now where when he wants to just strangle his 5-year-old sister can annoy the hell out of him sometimes. And I'll see him like run to the couch and just scream into a pillow. And I'm like, buddy, like anger is valid. Just don't hurt her. Don't hurt yourself, but it helps him just move through it. And then it's just like simple and over. It takes 30 seconds. Whereas I spent 30 years stuffing that shit. And then it was like a volcano that wanted to explode.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I think of a lot of things. I think it's so important. I think, taboo emotion for women kind of statistically is rage, and for men is grief.
Mm-hmm.
These big taboo emotions that get thwarted and held as private and locked in the tissue. Then if there's no space for it, what happens is the facial structures get locked in a kind of crystal. Have you experienced this in the middle of an argument where your face just loses expression, and it's almost like your face becomes a cage, and you're like, it's like this face of conflict that gets, crystallized in the tissue. And there's no way to express it anymore. We're kind of locked in a prison in the musculature of our face. Mm-hmm. So like coaching people to, get the facial muscles going, get the tongue out, like getting things moving. Screaming into pillows is a great example. I like to get people stomping. I use stomping a lot. Stomping is a lot about establishing autonomy, expressing selfhood. The legs are a lot about autonomy. Hey, let's move that out, that thwarted impulse. Let's get it through. One of the coolest moments I remember working with people was I used to live in New Zealand. And I was working with this woman who had deeply repressed anger. She had been sexually abused and subject to betrayal trauma as well. And after a while of working with her, we decided that we were going to I invited her to buy a huge stack of plates So she just went to whatever the equivalent of like a Goodwill is or
Yeah.
whatever in New Zealand. She got a ton of plates. We went to a cave, this cave out in the middle of nowhere in New Zealand. And I had her smash plates against the side of the cave for like an hour or something like that. It was just amazing, right? Because nobody there. We're in this cave. It was just this archetypal moment. And apparently, like in the 1950s, they had built a dance floor in this cave. And like people had gone to do their, I don't know, what did they do in New Zealand in the 50s? Like swing or something, West Coast. I don't know what they did, but it was wild to, and, you know, yeah, 1950s dance, but the cave probably had a really, really, really long history of people going in there to do primordial stuff. Just, you know,
Yeah.
light the fire and let it rip and let those big forces within get expressed.
So interesting. I just Googled it. Rock and roll, jitterbug, swing, and picturing all of that happening in the cave. That's so cool. What you said also reminds me of a C.S. Lewis quote. I'm pretty sure it's C.S. Lewis where he said, "I sat with my anger long enough until it told me its real name was grief."
Yeah.
And you saying like, yeah, for women, anger is taboo. For men, it's grief. It's like, ooh, what if they're just like twin flames of each other?
Well, yeah, that's really interesting because in my personal growth process over time and working with people over time, what I found is that occasionally there's these weird convergent moments in therapy. Like, for example, when grief turns into laughter,
Mm-hmm.
or like in the middle of working through a trauma, all of a sudden laughter erupts. But there's this really strange convergence where periodically grief will start to feel like rage, like raging grief.
Mm-hmm.
And rage will start to converge with more like the rage is grief. So it's like this weird. So sometimes I think people need to find that layer on either side where seriousness and being in the thick of a trauma needs to kind of smash through into laughter.
Yeah.
Where the diaphragm is going like this.
Yeah.
I think that's a way of kind of shaking off the trauma is laughter, right? Because the diaphragm goes like this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that we could do shaking, and shaking is useful, but a really effective way of doing that is the feel good fluctuation of laughter. And that's a really efficient way of releasing trauma, but it's hard to do clinically, right? What are you going to do? Tell a joke in the middle of a, you know?
Can try. I feel like when it's forced, it never lands.
Yeah, right.
That's funny. I've never thought of that. Because, yeah, I use shaking all the time, but I'm like, oh my God, yeah. Laughing, same thing. But I mean, like we talked about at the beginning of this episode, laughter is such a huge, often missing piece of healing. Healing can feel so serious and so heavy. And I like highly attribute so much of me getting out of that freeze response to my favorite show, Schitt's Creek, you know, to a book that I got at the time, which was like something about, I had a toddler at the time, which was just extra hot sauce on top of my already dumpster fire of a situation. And something about like, why does my toddler act like that? And it was just like, it was the sarcasm that I so desperately needed. Even now I'm on this journey with putting my mom on hospice, and it is heavy as hell and it is grief. And I have found myself getting really close to another friend who lost her mom. And I'm like, oh my God, my humor has never been darker. Did this happen to you when you were losing your mom? She's like, oh my God, yeah, you need to laugh or else you cry type situation all the time. So yeah, all that to say, cheers for laughter. It's a huge piece of learning to reclaim vitality when life has just gotten you so rigid, so frozen, so heavy.
I think that, and this is what the medicine of comedians is a lot of times, you know, just that humor has this kind of humus, right? Humility, it all has this kind of base root of earth. And what does the earth do? It throws up life, but it also decays and dies. My wife is Russian and I'm learning the Russian language. And I was struck by this closeness of the two words humor and death. So, humor is humor and death is umr.
Wow.
Humor, umr, humor, umr. And, for those Russian listeners out there, I might have gotten it a bit wrong, but you get what my point here, right? The gallows sense of humor, just this dark sense of humor can really set people free, right? Like when we're just in it, we can be in this heavy stuff with couples, or with somebody that's been betrayed. And then a vector of humor comes in, and it has to do with the potential of the death of the relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you've been through this stuff. You're in this field of just like, it's like a dying possibility. There's the buzzer beater thing is like the game is about to die here, and sometimes it's just incredible how humor can come in sometimes, even with dying people, right? When my dad was dying, it was extraordinary how there was these moments of laughter.
Yeah.
When we stopped fighting it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that was the first reel that I stumbled upon that led me to somatic work, the coach I ended up investing in. But she was joking about betrayal trauma. And I was like, who jokes about betrayal trauma? Oh my God, this is like the heaviest thing a woman can feel. But it's what drew me in. So it's so good. And what you said about learning how it's a natural thing. So when we first did put my mom on hospice, it felt like the most terrifying nightmare. Scariest thing that I can imagine, because this is a woman who's known me from the earliest of earliest, right? There's no one that knows me as well and as long as her. But in this journey, I've just read different books, talked to different people. Like it's been a process, and I'm learning to accept how much of a natural part of life this is, and seeing the beauty in it, the sacred moments. The grief's definitely still there, but it's feeling so much more like, okay, it's all happening at the pace it's meant to in the way that it's meant to.
What was that C.S. Lewis quote again about rage or grief? Rage and grief.
I sat with my anger long enough until it told me its real name was grief.
Yeah. So I wrote on my paper here, raging grief and grieving rage. That sometimes there's these moments clinically where a person is grieving and the kind of bottom drops out. Then they start to wail. Like this is a big event in a man's healing process. It certainly was for me, but in my work with men over time, there's this transition point with the big emotions where it's kind of stops being personal in this weird sort of way where the grief is not so much anymore about one's personal grief, but like the grief, where it's just like the bottom drops out and we're no longer in this kind of ego space of like my grief and what happened to me. And it just becomes like this pouring out. And that's when I have seen this strange phenomenon of grieving rage and raging grief where they kind of converge in this wail. And it's like, it doesn't have to be that complex or poetic. I mean, just look at a kid too, where, they don't get their chocolate or something like that. And there's this frustration, there's this rage, but there's this grief. I want it. I need to.
Yeah.
And that there's a sense of that it's bigger than the person. I mean, it's like, it's kind of hard to, focus on a task or something when a kid is, doing that. But I think it's essential for a person's healing in the case of a man to find that pivot point where the grief is just about oneself and what happened. And all of a sudden one is wailing. I've heard a lot of guys say this before, right? Like I cried like a baby.
Yeah.
And there's like some judgment about like crying like a baby. Like the image of the stoic guy that sort of like is afforded one tear at a funeral or something like that, where everything is just kind of held in this face, the face of grief, just like similar to the face of anger where things can get locked up. When grief really opens up, it opens up into a wail, this expansive, go to an Irish wake or something like that, or, a tribal ritual or something like that, where people are really grieving, it does really start to converge with rage, a raging expression, fountain.
Yeah. Interesting. Last night we watched the Colombia Argentina Copa final. We're big soccer fans, and there was like a big tournament that was the final. And so my husband's family is Colombian, and they played Argentina. Messi is like the top player in the world. He's on Argentina. He got injured and had to sit the game out, and he was just crying openly, just like boohoo crying. And my father-in-law, who's got deep Latino heritage, was like, "Oh, cry baby." And I cringed inside. I know he was joking, but it's like, but not, because I know that that has never been something that he has been allowed to feel. Like, that's actually a deep, deep conditioning for men in our society. And I just wanted to like stand up for Messi, and be like, "This is beautiful. Let it out. This is like, we grieve. You're supposed to win the title and you don't get to be a part of the win, and you're the best player in the world." But I remember feeling the same way when my grandfather, who is this like a super respected, stoic, like doctor, and when he lost his wife, he was just crying and not apologizing for it and not hiding his face. And I feel like I never respected him more than seeing him in that moment. There was not a hint of like crybaby that went through my mind, but I know it might be different being a man. Again, for women, that's more of like an allowed emotion.
Yeah. Yeah. For men, sometimes big time, but there can also be, I see it in women as well. This kind of, as soon as the crying starts, like I immediately need to find like a tissue to kind of dab the makeup and stuff, and kind of thwart it. And I like my joke in this moment is I make, as a therapist, I make snot commissions. So just let it flow. So just let it blast. Come on. Like let it blast the life force. I think this back to the relatedness of grief and rage, and you mentioned soccer. Sometimes there's these, you have these riots, right? Where people get hurt, people get trampled, people get killed.
Yeah.
In this moment of loss.
Yeah.
It's a moment of loss. And then instead of going towards the grief or even towards raging grief, it's toppled into rage, and the rage causes trouble. There's a conflagration. And to me, an antidote to that, and I think an antidote to so many problems in couples and in culture is a lack of a public grieving ritual, a public grieving function. So, because a loss happens, and then people go towards rage, war, vengeance, conflagration. And if we could instead go towards the raging aspects of grief and ritualize that and create a sacred container for it, sacred grief, it ends up being very, very restorative, right? So imagine, it's silly to think about it in a way like, okay, after there's been a big loss at a soccer game, a community ritual where people are wailing in grief, but that is much more healthy.
Yeah. My God.
Right? Nobody's going to get trampled, right?
It's so fascinating. Yeah. Cause that's literally what happened the game before when, Uruguay played. Yeah, I'm blanking who it was, but there was a big fight, big fight that broke out after it. I'm like, oh, I'm glad I wasn't there. So real.
Yeah. And if we could just find our way to a public grieving ritual. And I think one of the most powerful things that a couple can do when there's been a trauma of some kind, but not just a betrayal trauma, but just as a function for a couple to come together to grieve, not just grieve personally over my personal loss or my personal pain, my personal resentments and stuff, but like that the couple itself needs to grieve together without the resentments, just the grief, just come together and cry and forget about the content as much, but just express the grief. And when couples do that, when they're able to cry together, it can just be extraordinarily healing, where it's not, I'm crying because you hurt me.
Yeah.
And I'm crying because you hurt me. But we're crying because we're crying, because life is difficult, because things happen, because we become stingy over time, because we accumulate resentments over time. And that bucket just overflows. And, let's ditch content in the egoic, gluey space and Velcro and stuff, and just have the grief, blast us open into something much bigger than ourselves.
So interesting. Because even reflecting on my own marriage, like it started like that, where I'd cry because you did this to me. And he would, get angry because you did this to me, And then it feels like as we've healed and gotten healthier, we've taken turns holding space for the tears, not in a blaming way, but thinking about it now, I'm like, we've never cried together that I can remember, at least that I can think of. But just hearing you describe it, I'm like, I can see how powerful that would be. I'm going to be like, Sebastian, guess what? I was talking to Brian. I have an idea. Why did I? He's going to be like, oh my God, I like that Brian guy until.
I don't know.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
but I can see how powerful that could be. One of my clients recently, for their 30th wedding anniversary, there's, betrayal trauma in their marriage, and they've both gone through somatic work now, and it's beautiful to see how they're healing. But they got a piñata for their 30th anniversary, and they put in it like all the things that they're ready to get rid of and that, they are done with, as far as like what's been toxic over these last 3 decades. And they just whacked the hell out of it together and had so much fun. And I was like, that is such a fantastic idea. They thought of that all on their own, but I'm like, I should add that to one of my modules as a very viable option for grief.
Yeah, coming up with meaningful things done together is just so powerful. Just creating, we could use the word ritual, but the word ritual has all sorts of baggage for some people, right? So I like to just think creating a meaningful event together, meaningful things done together, where there's a co-creation of meaning and you mobilize the forces of the emotions. Like, because, there's aggression. We're batting the piñata. But the piñata has this egg of wonderful meaning. There's a little chick inside. Yeah, a little chick inside that's tweeting, like goodness, and the things that once that stuff has been released, then that chick gets released out of the muck, as it were.
Yeah.
The stuff that's been released. So tweet.
The good kind of Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the popular Instagram themes that's taken off for you has been self-abandonment, right?
Yeah.
Women are really interested in this dynamic of self-abandonment. Can you talk a little bit about that self-abandonment?
Yeah. What I have found so interesting, because a lot of the women that do come to me have either been abandoned emotionally or physically by their parents or significant people in their life, their husband, or have gone through betrayal or infidelity or abuse. And so all of these like really obvious things that have happened to them, and they have every right to stay a victim, call themselves a victim. But it's amazing because they're not. They decide to step back into power, and reclaim their power. But what I find with all of these women who come with this long list of like all of these things done to them and really deep pains, what they end up coming into touch with or admitting or whatever you want to call it is the deepest pain of all is how I've abandoned myself and how I didn't either trust my intuition or stand up for myself or speak my truth, or how my marriage has felt like a decade-long or couple-decade-long fawn response of just trying to please him in order to make sure he doesn't leave me. And that is really where women will break down. Women who on the outside have it all together. They're doctors who show up and speak very, coherently and with confidence. And in the back of their mind, they're thinking about how they felt like this little girl who was desperate for her husband's approval and like how do I make sense of this identity conflict, right now? So women on the outside who show up a certain way when deep, deep, deep down inside, they do feel like, who the hell even am I? And why can't I feel the way I do in these like outer spheres in my own marriage, in the relationship that's closest to me? And so that's the work we really get to healing. The deeper wound is the self-abandonment.
And how does that connect with the functional freeze response?
Yeah, it's a good question. Functional freeze, just in general you're like, what is that? It's just maybe on the outside, you are able to go to work, get things done, still accomplish things, but internally or in your behind the scenes relationships, you do feel this frozen energy of like, I don't know which way to go, whether that's should I stay or go in my marriage, or should I talk to my husband or wait until later, or even like little decisions, like feeling like so indecisive of like, I don't know if I should the apples or the oranges at the store, it can be little things too. And so the self abandonment, I think deep, deep down, it's an identity crisis of like, who am I? What do I actually value? What do I want in life? What is my purpose? And being caught in that survival response because of what they're going through in their marriage at the time, and not knowing like which path to take to feel aligned with those internal values. So I don't know if that answers, but I think that's the connection.
Yeah. There's a principle that I talk about in my book and in my training of trauma resolution practitioners called the thwarted impulse, where our body, our psyche has a impulse to express. Our self wants to express, our body wants to express. And through all these messaging dynamics, arrow number 1, arrow number 2, arrow number n-1, whatever, how many arrows are coming in, and they collectively create a thwarted impulse. So in my trauma resolution work, that's one of the key regions of being a detective is like, what is the thwarted impulse? What is the impulse? Like, what is, and then this connects quite well with frozenness and self-abandonment, right? Because the impulse is frozen in there somewhere, frozen in the tissues, the thing that wants to be said, where the tissues of the mouth want to organize and the tissues of the larynx want to say particular stuff. Maybe it's like a lot of times it's just a growl or something. Or running. Running is a big one. That's why I use stomping a lot. Like the traumatized body just wants to run on some level, and the thwarted impulse is the running. So I got to figure out what sort of sequencing the nervous system wants to do that's been frozen and thwarted. And then once it gets set free, then there's much more available to the person.
Yeah, I love that. It's just finding a toolkit, for people who are in that state of what's going to be helpful. And I love what you said. And I often find too, people caught in this state, just gentle, spontaneous, playful movement, like the body that's in a freeze response can respond super well to that. Just slight little gentle patterns, no like forcing, not creating too much discomfort, but whether it's soft dancing or like yin yoga, walking, play, any gentle practice you enjoy. Journaling can be helpful for a lot of people, but not if it's going to be this like overly deep dive, heavy catharsis thing that's going to keep you more stuck. But just journaling gratitude or a dear God prayer or, a note to self. And then grounding tools are just a really basic preliminary go-to that I teach women in a freeze response, just learning how to be more present, and even little things like, okay, I have to pee, so I'm actually going to take a break from work and go pee, like learning to reorient that mind body connection on the most basic level most of us have just ignored for years. or like, I stink, I'm gonna actually go take a shower.
Yeah.
Or like, I'm hungry, I'm gonna go eat, and just practicing orienting to the here and now through our senses when most of us have just been so disconnected for so long.
Maybe you could just walk us through a case study, maybe pluck an example, a case example of a woman that you worked with, maybe betrayal trauma case, where there was a lot of this freeze stuff.
Mhm.
And, as you said, you like to focus on grounding tools to begin with. Maybe there's a way that you could walk us through some of the somatic things done to
Sure.
get this freeze response shaken off and get the body freedom again.
Yeah, I'm like, who do I choose? All the names are running through. Okay, so one woman I'm gonna call to mind, and she came in. She's married to an Army vet, so he's also got complex PTSD from actual combat experience, and there was betrayal trauma in their marriage. They've been married for 30 years. On the outside, they're the it couple in their small town. Everyone's like, oh, I wish we could have a marriage like yours. Behind the scene, it was on its final thread. So when she came in, she is successful in her own right and her job. Behind the scenes, she was crumbling, frozen, hypervigilant, indecisive, checking all his phone all the time, caught in that frigid freeze response. So learning tools, her favorites at the beginning were the 5 senses and box breathing. So really simple things she could do in a moment when she felt frozen or triggered. She would be like, okay, time for 5 senses. I'm going to name 5 things I can see, 4 things I can hear, 3 things I can touch, 2 things I can smell, 1 thing I can taste. And she would do that on repeat. And at first it was like, is this doing anything? This feels so basic. And like, is this shifting? And that's part of the work, is teaching clients like, hey, you don't need this mind shattering, new cataclysmic shift where fireworks go out. We actually have had plenty of that. There's been plenty of chaos in our last year, right? For like a lifetime. So we're actually going to slow down and learn that real transformation happens in these tiny, imperceivable shifts that are just practiced on repeat over and over and over again. That's how we're going to thaw. So that was a go-to for her. Another was box breathing. So again, when frozen or in a moment of trigger, she'd breathe in her nose for 3 or 4 seconds, hold for 3 or 4 seconds, breathe out her mouth for 3 or 4 seconds, hold for 3 or 4 seconds. So called box breathing because you're picturing, tracing a box. And those were her go-tos. I laid out like, hey, here's a smorgasbord of grounding tools. You get to try on what fits, what doesn't. And those were always her top 2. So it created over time these like tiny little decisions day after day on repeat, a new nervous system state. For the first time, she's like, oh my God, like I don't feel frozen. I don't feel like I'm bracing for the next shoe to drop. I feel like I've got me for the first time ever. Very much a case of from self-abandonment to, oh my God, I've got me on a level I've never had me before, and I will never betray myself again. And her husband started to feel the difference and started to move closer to her. They started to have safe conversations, transparent conversations for the first time ever. And the rest is history. They have a beautiful, redemption story, still not perfect. Especially on his like Memorial Day is a big trigger day, but like they're on the path to healing. So that was the beginning.
It's really interesting. I'm thinking about trauma as a type of contagion. Like trauma is contagious when a person when they've been triggered into a traumatic state, and the nervous system is replaying the past in the here and now. That state is contagious.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm thinking about with this couple, that, you have this huge trauma, war trauma. It's in the relational field. It's kind of in the groundwater or something like that, so that you treat any one component of the system, you treat one person, It can help to decontaminate. You get the hazmat suits. Do you have a hazmat suit?
Of course. You? I'm like, closet. It's true though. Or those movies. Isn't there a movie called Contagion? Or at least it's about that. Yeah, that was really good.
Yeah.
But it is contagious, and it's weird because it's invisible, but it's like when couples say, I feel like there's an elephant in the room and I can't put my finger on it. Like that's exactly what it is. Energy isn't seen, but it's definitely felt. Like we're all emitting different vibrational frequencies at all times. So sometimes those frequencies feel really good. And that's when we say things like, I vibe with her or I vibe with him. And also when it's the opposite, it's like, I don't know what it is about that person, but they give me the ick. Like all of these kind of common phrases today really do speak to that, what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm lobbying to repackage the elephant in the room idiom to something that has bigger teeth, or like an elephant stampede, or a contender would be a gray dragon with poison tipped claws.
So much more accurate. Yeah. Elephants
A big gray dragon with poison tipped claws and venom dripping off the teeth, like in Aliens, but bigger. Something like that instead of an elephant. A white elephant? Nah.
too Christmassy. That's too happy. Yeah. No, because elephants are like cool and wise, and Dumbo was super cute. So you're right. Yeah, we need a new character.
Enter gray dragon.
Exactly.
In the background somewhere with a couple, right? And it's like, honey, will you make me a coffee, please? And then behind the person asking is like this.
As I add that to my content ideas.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I really love about you is you are transparent about the humanness and all this stuff. What is our image of health here? Yeah, our image of health here, let's be frank, isn't some, it's not some image of perfection where we leave behind, the big forces of life, like the aggressive forces permanently.
Mm-hmm.
In the podcast here, the Boundless Body podcast, we like to keep on coming back to this philosophical question: what can a body do? Comes from Spinoza, the great philosopher. It's a simple sounding question, but it's also a deep question. It's like, well, we do the trauma stuff, we do the betrayal work. Well, in order to what? Like, what is our image of health? Like, what can our bodies do? If we heal, what are we capable of? Like, where are we headed with this stuff? And it's one of the things that I love about your work is that, hey, let's keep it real. Like, it's like this, there's this voice that, there's something going on here that is, I don't think we're about an image of perfection, but what image are we about? What can a body do? What do you think about that?
I love that. And it does sound simple, but it's super deep. Two things come to mind. One is when someone first asked me, like, at what point in your life did you feel the safest, just the most vitality, the most love, peace? It was an immediate memory of being a little girl laying in the sun spot, that spot where sun shone through the back window and it made like a square of light. And I used to curl up there like a cat. And I just remember feeling like not a care in the world, like no worries ruminating through my head. My muscles were untensed. My breath was deep. Like I just was at ease. I wasn't high energy, but I wasn't low energy. It was just felt good. And so for me, it's like, I didn't know I could feel that again. It feels like through this work, I've been able to be like, oh my God, this reminds me of my original essence. But also it's with this new version of me that also has some wisdom along the way and is not as naive. And I can breathe deep and I actually feel safe. I actually feel at ease. I can feel the warmth of the sun hitting my skin and I'm not waiting for the next ball to drop. It's this just satisfaction and peace. A lot of clients I work with, though, don't have a memory to fall back on. They're like, I don't remember a time when I felt safe. And so sometimes it's either fragments of like, I felt kind of safe in this situation. This is what felt safe. But then it was also like muddled with this part that was fearful. And so we will either like pull from the fragments, or we can start new and start from here. And like, let's taste what little, even if it's just this incremental 1 inch of safety, can feel like. And we'll build a blueprint if you don't have it already. But yeah, for me, that's what comes to mind is safety, vitality, peace. And that can be different, right? For you, it might be a totally different thing of what you want to feel in your body. But then another thing came to mind and it escaped me. So if it comes back, I'll let you know.
Yeah, there's this term in biodynamic craniosacral work, which I taught that stuff worldwide for quite some time. It's called the original blueprint for health, which maps quite well onto your work and what you're about. I think this is wonderful and this is great. Yeah, like searching for the blueprint, the essence of what makes a person feel like themselves and feel like they're anchored in their own style of living, their own wonderfulness, their own unique type of shine. And yeah, you're right. And for me, it was like one of the most foundational moments in somatics for me was this old guy, Bruce Berger, who teaches polarity therapy. He's still doing it. He's in his 80s. You know, I lived up on the hills of far Northern California for a while. He does all this weird shit like pulling on your toes and stuff like that and getting you to tone and do weird stuff. But one of the simple things that he did in the beginning was he said, Brian, open up to an image of when you were 5, and tell me what did they call you when you were 5? And I said, Brizey. And then he asked me to generate an image of that time. And I immediately burst out crying because it was a blueprint. It was my essence. It was my original blueprint, and it was like, I think I was like building like a fort, which is weirdly enough, it's kind of like a therapy image, right? You build an enclosure for people to feel safe in, right? And I'm sitting there in the sun and, just like I'm building, I got my shovel and stuff like that. And I'm building a fort. And, like, it's just so wonderful. And when I feel like I can do that with other people, it's not just me by myself in this image. It's an image of I'm working with other people to build a fort.
Yeah.
What can a body do? It's not just about me and my essence. It's like, how can I put that into relational fields? How can we do fort building, you and I right here? I think we're doing it. We're building a fort. What's involved in the fort? Well, it's some lying in the sun. It's like stretching out like a cat where the muscles are relaxed and, that you put in your combination and then we bring in a third figure and a fourth figure and we do our best to kind of elicit those blueprints. But the wondrous element is how they combine. But then I think you brought a really good point up. A lot of people don't have that. People that are really traumatized, you ask them for a moment of safety or a moment of goodness, and they get subject to intrusions. Yeah. And one of the errors in somatics is just assuming that a person's body is always going to be a safe place to be, which is wrong. We can't just assume that, if a person starts reading out their sensations in their body or tracking their emotions, that everything will be peachy. In fact, with a really traumatized person, usually the contrary. Same thing with this childhood blueprint thing. Mm-hmm. If we go to the childhood or whatever, and they start looking for a good memory and they find one, they start working it, boom, then we have an intrusion where something really bad happens. Or let's say, for example, they're thinking about a beloved grandma who they had this wonderful experience with, and it is their blueprint, but then grandma died in a horrible situation. It's not really a blueprint at the moment. As you said, it's a fragment. So then we got to find pieces of the map, pieces of the blueprint elsewhere, and kind of stitch together something. And one of the things that I often use is like symbolism, drawing from literature, drawing from dreams, drawing from movies. Like what image in a movie really reminds you of a kind of glorious body or like poetry or something like that. And eventually over time, then we can kind of stitch together a blueprint.
I love that. I actually haven't done that, but it goes along with what I noticed some clients shaming themselves for is getting caught in the fantasy. They're like, I'm coping by fantasy. I'm like, that's so wonderful. Like, you are built with that. It is literally how people have survived some horrendous situations that they are actually caught in and can't get out of. The fact that you have imagination is a beautiful thing. So I like that idea a lot of even using a movie or novel, because that's something that feels safer. It's a bit more removed. Not something.
It's a bit out there, right? And that really traumatized people. The literature shows that third person narrative consciousness is safer.
Yeah.
A third person awareness from a brain neuroscience perspective is just a safer place to start with heavily traumatized people. And, we're the storytelling species, right? So let's use that rich heritage of storytelling and narrativization, to get a safe symbolic object, like a character in a film or something like that, or in literature, that they actually have a map of in their brain that they can relate with. When we're reading, we identify with the characters. Otherwise, it wouldn't get us to keep coming back again. Netflix binges and stuff, right? It's because we identify with the characters, right? So why not use that imagination to create a safe fort, right, with the symbolic object, and then gradually, kind of plug that into other elements from their life. And of course, what we're going to have to do in the process is we're going to have to give them a way to contain the intrusions, where they're thinking, they're starting to map their blueprint. They're starting to feel it. They're starting to, like, I feel like I'm in the forge, or I feel like I'm in the sun. And then boom, we're back in time somewhere. And that using simple practices like grounding exercises, breathing exercises to kind of give a container for the intrusions, to ward them off and so on.
Yeah, I love that. I love it.
Yeah. Well, let's see here. I do want to give you an opportunity to talk about any other themes that have been really popular on your podcast and in your Instagram, because it's really fun stuff. I hope the listeners out there will check out Becky's work, because it's really a great combination of depth and humor. That's the stuff that I love. So is there any other themes that have become popular that we haven't covered yet?
Now that you mention it, my podcast editor made me aware that the most downloaded episode right now is Will Separation Ruin My Kids? So I find that a very common collective deep fear for women going through that decision of should I stay or should I go. It's muddled and harder to decide, because they're like, if I didn't have kids in the picture, it'd be hard enough. But it's like this double compounded fear of I'm going to be the reason they're in therapy one day. That was my deepest fear. And I find that to be really, really common.
I think that connects quite well with, you were talking about sabotaging archetypes before. And what was the most popular one for women again?
For my friend group, hyperachiever, and my client community.
Hyperachiever. And I'm imagining that a lot of those women are mothers.
A majority, like 90% of my clients.
Yeah. So it curiously converges with the Jungian tradition of archetypal psychology, where you have the mother archetype. I think for good reasons is, kind of perfectionistic, very mama bear, very, just like needs to keep things in order for the survival of the species and so on. But the Jungians say that sometimes a human woman can get possessed by the mother archetype, so that the human gets kind of like hip checked out, like in hockey or something. Like the human mother gets hip checked out, and then what you have is an archetypal possession state, where it's the mother archetype that comes in, and there's not a human mother in there that can kind of be okay with imperfections. It's like just this enormous ordering principle that is impossible I mean, it's impossible to be perfect. I think we put way too much on mothers in hidden in the attachment psychology trip is putting too much responsibility on attachment relationships. And it's often just leading back to the mother. And that slots in quite well with the mother archetype, right? So I think it's not surprising to me that the most popular one up until this point is exactly that. Will the separation ruin my kids? I think the way that I translate it is the mother archetype, it just wants to be perfect all the time. And the human mother can get hooked by that. And once one is hooked by that, it's like, no, everything is a potential imperfection. Everything is a potential to be responsible for. Any type of suffering in the kid, any type of imperfection in the kid, any mental suffering in the kid, all roads lead back to the mother. And it just slots quite well with the mother archetype thing.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I remember talking to a friend who does like mission work over in Africa, and she's like, over there, mothers don't beat themselves up the way they do here in the US. Here in the US, we're like, every little thing, oh my God, this is traumatizing them, and we're overthinking and self-punishing. And she's like, over there, they're just like, kids will be fine. And so I think those are two ends of the pendulum. What I know to be true, and if I could go back to myself like 5 years ago when that was my core fear. It was like, is all of this going to ruin the kids? I'd be able to tell myself to have so much, like take heart and have so much peace, because this actually is what could be the reason they evolve into securely attached, healthy adults. It's such an opportunity to break generational trauma, where a lot of us from the previous generation, there was that pressure of perfectionism, especially, like my mom's generation. Mothers were expected to really look a certain way, really appear a certain way. And so there was so much correction on our behavior and not a whole lot of allowing of our, like you call, intrinsic kind of knee-jerk experiences, emotions. And so now I feel like on the other side, it's my superpower as a mom that we went through that. And I still talk to my son about that time because he's old enough to remember. And it's become a very big open door to just show him like, hey, mommy and daddy struggle and we're not perfect. And we got through hard times and still have hard times. And truly my biggest hope for my kids is that they would feel safe enough to come to me with anything and everything, good, bad, and ugly. And the more that I play games with my son or just talk to my son about my mistakes, and by games, I just mean is sometimes before bed, I'll be like, hey, you want to play Ask Me Anything? And we'll ask each other, 3 questions each. And I tell him, I'll tell you whatever. I'm an open book, Ollie. There's nothing you can ask that I won't answer. And so it's creating this safety and vulnerability to just be open. And man, does he get fascinated by hearing about the times I got in trouble or really messed up, things like that. So I would say that to the moms with that core fear is this could actually be the best thing ever. If you can use this as an opportunity to, let your kids cry and not expect them to fix you, but to take it as an opportunity to say mommy's super sad and having a really hard day and I'm working through it. I've got my support, but that's what I needed as a kid was an image and permission that crying is okay. It was actually the opposite that did some damage, is that, mistakes are not allowed.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah, I have a 16-year-old and she's from another father and she's my own now. The biological father died a few years ago. And when we first met, she was about 7 or 8. Of course, with another man, things are complex, right? The warming up process is complex. We had a great relationship to begin with, but something in her unconscious was really resisting, embracing me, accepting me. We were having fun. Things were warming up, but there was still some barrier there. And it all came to a head when we were visiting family. So I brought her to introduce her to my family. And as is often the case with family, things heated up. Stressors started to get a bit higher.
Yeah.
And at some point I popped and I just started crying. And I came into bed, and like I was talking about, this wasn't one of those just subdued one tear thing, but I was like put upon by all these forces and just struggling with the fact that she was holding this barrier up to me. And it wasn't like, an intentional crying or something like that because I feel bad and I want to make her feel bad. This is a different type of crying. It's the type of crying that I can pull out of if I need to. But after that, you see, things opened up. Things really, really opened up. The fact that I was able to go to that place and just weep. And then not only that, come out of it and say, no, this isn't about you. It's just that I'm sad because I feel like you have this barrier that's up and it hurts. And it's not your fault. I understand. And so we can come. So, and it really just opened things up for us. And, and one way of packaging all this, I think, is that with trauma-informed therapy and trauma-informed life, one of the dangers is that we become we could start having a compulsive orientation to fragility. Mm-hmm. Can you see that, right? I'm sure you've seen this where it's like, we're just going to assume that there's going to be a fragility.
Yeah.
That's not a great assumption. I like to say that life is a paradox of profound fragility and profound resilience. You know what I mean? It's like, so we got to kind of like stay in a dynamism of orienting to potential fragilities and, weaknesses and vulnerabilities, but not just assume that and just live life on tippy toes. We want to be able to also nurture resilience, nurture truth, nurture complexity, because the difficulties are going to come no matter what at some point.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful example. And the way you phrased it to her, had a similar experience. My mom remarried when my dad died, and there was always that resistance. And like you said, things have warmed up over time. And now this journey that we're on right now has made both of us cry more than ever because he's losing his wife, I'm losing my mom. But it's bonded us in a way that we've never experienced. It feels like, whoa, I never expected to feel the kind of bondedness I'm experiencing right now with this guy.
Yeah, and I really felt like I graduated when she gave me the nickname on her phone, which she does with her teenage friends now. This kind of combination of a kind of like compliment that is a diss and a compliment at the same time. She started calling me Queen Buttface. When I was like, okay, I'm in now.
I have made it. This is the title I've been striving for my whole
I'm in. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Becky. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This was awesome.
Yeah, I hope we get to collaborate again. It's really fun to have some laughs with you and go deep. And is there anything you want to pitch for the audience in terms of your work?
Pitch my free webinar that I give everyone when they're first getting to know me. It's 3 Secrets to Thriving Intimacy. It's just everything I wish I had known 10 years before getting into the spot that we found ourselves when I needed a buzzer beater. So just hoping to save people a decade of unnecessary trauma. So I can make sure you have that link for the show notes. And there's also, that's like where my landing page is. So you can also see client testimonials, a little bit more about me.
Great. Awesome. So check it out, y'all. And again, thanks, Becky.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Thank you for listening to The Boundless Body with the Somatic Doctor. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and like us on social media.
We're a swarm. We're a colony. We're a multiplicity.
Until next time, be well.